In 1945, a government file in Washington described a German rocket engineer was described as a potential security threat. Months later, a new report described the same man. The threat was gone. The words had changed. The man had not. His name was Wernher von Braun. But that is not the part that stayed classified. This is a detail in this story most people never learn. I will get to it. It is not really about the rockets. It is about the paperwork and what the paperwork was built to smooth over. This is a documented story. Every major claim here rests on the public record, government archives, declassified files, agency histories. Where the record is firm, I will say so. Where it goes quiet, I will say that too, because the quiet parts are where myths are usually born. Start with the plain facts. In 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany's weapons programs did not simply vanish. The machines were captured, the factories were photographed, and the men who built them were still alive. The United States wanted that knowledge. So did the Soviet Union. What followed had a code name. It was called Operation Paperclip. The program had a quiet manager. It was the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Its task was easy to state and hard to defend. Bring German specialists to America. Put their expertise to work. Do it before the Soviets could. The agency was formed in 1945. It operated with little public attention. That was the point. To understand the urgency, remember the moment. The alliance that beat Germany was already breaking apart. The Soviet Union and the United States were turning from partners into rivals. Weapons that could cross continents were now imaginable. Whoever mastered the rocket might shape the next age of war. In that light, a German engineer was not just a scientist. He was an asset in a contest that had barely begun. The scale grew over time. Commonly cited figures place the total at more than 1,600 scientists and engineers. They arrived over several years. They came with their families. They came with their notebooks. Some came with histories. The public was never meant to read closely. The name itself tells you something. The program is often traced to a simple office habit. A paperclip was fastened to the file of each specialist the officers wanted to keep. It marked a candidate worth pursuing, even when the record raised questions. A small metal clip. A quiet signal. Bring this one in. The effort did not begin under that name. An earlier version was called Operation Overcast. It started in the summer of 1945. Paperclip grew out of it and outlasted it. The mission stayed the same. Only the label changed, and not everyone in the government approved. The State Department raised objections. So did parts of the Justice Department. They worried about the rule the president had set. They worried about who exactly was being let in. Those objections are in the record. In the end, they were worked around. It was not only rocket men either. The program reached across many fields: aeronautics, medicine, chemistry, physics. The hunt was for expertise of every useful kind. The rocket engineers became the most famous faces of it, but they were part of a much wider sweep of recruited talent. To understand why the rockets mattered most, go back to a stretch of coast in northern Germany. The place was called Peenemünde. It sat on the Baltic Sea. There, German engineers built a new kind of weapon. They called it the A4. The world would come to know it as the V2. The V2 was a rocket. It rose beyond the edge of the atmosphere. Then it fell back to Earth at enormous speed. There was no warning sound before impact. It arrived faster than the noise it made. As an engineering achievement, it was decades ahead of its time. As a weapon, it was terror delivered from the sky. The weapon was used. In the autumn of 1944, V2 rockets began falling on Allied cities. London was struck. Antwerp was struck. Each rocket carried a heavy warhead. Each arrived without warning. Thousands of civilians were killed in these attacks. This was not a test program. It was a weapon aimed at cities. There is another side to the same machine. A V2 test is often cited as the first human-made object to cross into space. The rocket that terrorized cities also touched the edge of the cosmos. That doubleness is the whole story in miniature. One machine, two legacies. Impossible to fully separate. Wernher von Braun was at the center of that work. He was young, he was gifted. The documented record is clear on one point. He led the technical development of the V2 program. His name is on that machine. His ambition had an older root. As a young man, he dreamed of space flight. He wanted to build rockets that reached the stars. But the money and the machinery came from an army preparing for war. So his dream was funded by a weapons program. The engineer who wanted to reach space helped build a tool to strike cities. That contradiction followed him for the rest of his life. Here is where the story stops being simple. The V-2 was not only designed, it was mass-produced, and it was produced in a place the surviving record describes in grim detail. The factory was underground. It was called the Mittelwerk. It was carved into a mountain in central Germany. The labor there did not come from paid workers. It came from prisoners. They were held at a concentration camp complex known as Mittelbaudora. The conditions are documented. Prisoners worked long hours in cold tunnels. They were starved. They were worked to death. The historical record indicates that thousands of prisoners died producing these rockets. By many accounts, more people died building the V-2 than were killed by it as a weapon. That is a hard sentence. Read it again slowly. After the war, this factory did not go unnoticed. There were trials. In 1947, a United States military court heard a case tied to the Dora camp and its underground plant. Some of the personnel connected to that place were prosecuted. So the crimes were not a later invention. They were recognized at the time in a courtroom on the record. That fact sits awkwardly beside what came next. So the question was never whether the rocket was impressive. The question was who built it and at what human cost. And that question sat inside the files that Operation Paperclip had to manage. Now move to the spring of 1945. The war was collapsing. Von Braun and a core group of his engineers made a choice. They did not want to be captured by the advancing Soviet forces. They moved to surrender to the Americans instead. The documented record shows they gave themselves up to United States troops in May 1945. The surrender has a documented detail. Von Braun's brother rode out to make the first contact. He approached American soldiers to arrange the group's surrender. The engineers had planned it. They chose the Western Allies deliberately. They judged that America offered a better future than captivity in the East. It was, above all, a decision about survival and about work. They did not arrive empty-handed. They carried decades of research. They knew where key documents were hidden. And American forces recovered captured V-2 hardware and parts. It was enough to reassemble and test rockets across the Atlantic. For the United States, this was a strategic prize. The knowledge in those men's heads was, by itself, a form of power. The Soviet Union was doing the same thing. Its forces reached Peenemünde and the eastern factories too. They gathered German rocket personnel and hardware of their own. Both superpowers raced to absorb the same defeated science. This was not one country's temptation. It was the shape of the whole post-war moment. The talent of a fallen regime became a prize for its conquerors. But there was a rule in the way. Official policy said that ardent Nazis were not to be brought to the United States. President Truman's guidance drew that line. The stated intent was clear. The country would take the expertise. It would not knowingly reward committed party men or war criminals. The phrase in the policy mattered. An ardent Nazi was to be excluded. But who decided what ardent meant? The judgment lived in a security report. A single evaluation could open the door or close it. That made the wording of each file powerful. Change the wording and you change the outcome. The gate was not a wall, it was a sentence on a page. That is why the paperwork is the real subject, not a secret meeting, not a dramatic betrayal, a quiet act of editing. Someone read a file, weighed the mission and chose milder words. Multiply that choice across many files. That is how a policy becomes a formality. On paper, the rule was firm. In practice, it collided with what the intelligence officers actually wanted. They wanted the scientists, all of them, including men whose files did not pass the test. Consider the position of the officers running the program. They had a mission and a deadline. The Cold War felt urgent and real. They believed the country needed this expertise, and they had rules that stood in the way. The record suggests how they resolved that conflict. When the mission and the rule collided, the rule was the thing that bent. That is not a conspiracy. It is a documented pattern of choices. This is the turn the documents reveal. And it is where you must be careful about what is proven and what is not. Here is what the record establishes. Von Braun had been a member of the Nazi Party. He had also held a rank in the SS. The declassified material confirms this. These are not rumors, they are matters of record. And here is what the later investigations found about the program itself. The security evaluations of some recruits were revised. Language that flagged a man as a threat was softened. Assessments that would have blocked entry were rewritten to allow it. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agencies, the very office running the program, was involved in sanitizing dossiers. That finding did not come from a rumor mill. It came from the United States government's own review of its records decades later. In 1998, Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. It forced the declassification of millions of pages. An interagency working group was created to carry it out. That group worked with the National Archives. Its purpose was to open the files and report what they showed. The scale of that disclosure was large. The working group oversaw the release of millions of pages of records. They touched many agencies, not only the rocket program. The broader finding was sobering. In the early Cold War, more than one American agency had at times made use of former enemies. Old records were weighed against new priorities. The priorities often won. What the group reported was uncomfortable. American intelligence agencies had, in some cases, knowingly used individuals with serious wartime records. The pursuit of talent and the pursuit of an early Cold War advantage had, at times, overridden the stated rules. The official account and the archival record did not match. That gap is the real subject here. Let me be precise about the limits, because this story is often told badly. The record proving that dossiers were sanitized is strong, but that is a statement about a program and its officers. It does not by itself settle the question of any single man's private guilt. Take von Braun himself. The record shows his party membership and his SS rank. The record shows he visited the Mittelwerk facility. What the record does not fully settle is the interior question. How much did he see? How much did he understand? How much power did he actually have to change the conditions? Historians still disagree about that. Some read the evidence as damning, others read it as a man trapped inside a murderous system he did not control. The surviving documents do not hand us a clean verdict. Anyone who tells you otherwise is filling a gap the archive left open. I want to hold that tension, not resolve it falsely. A man can be brilliant, a man can be complicit, a man can be both, and the record can still leave the exact measure unknown. That is not a satisfying answer. It is the honest one. So what happened to these men once they arrived? They were not hidden in a basement. They were put to work. The first stop for von Braun's group was Fort Bliss in Texas. There they helped the American military study and rebuild the V-2. Captured rockets were tested at the White Sands Range in New Mexico. The same technology that had fallen on cities was now being taken apart, studied, and improved. The group had an unofficial nickname in those years. Some called them the prisoners of peace. Their status was strange. They were not quite prisoners. They were not quite free citizens. They lived and worked under military control while their futures were decided. Their expertise was launched into the New Mexico sky. The captured German rocket had become an American teacher. Then the work moved to Alabama. In 9950, von Braun's team relocated to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville. That town would be reshaped by their presence. It became a center of American rocketry. The engineers who had built a weapon in one country were now building missiles in another. Huntsville changed around them. It had been a quiet southern town. It became a rocket city. Schools, streets, and industries grew up around the work. The German families settled in. Their children went to American schools. Within a generation, the town's identity was tied to men who had arrived under a classified program. Most residents knew only the achievements, not the archives. For a while, this was a military story. The rockets were about defense and about the arms race. But then the ground shifted again. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. A small satellite circled the Earth and beeped. The United States was stunned by it. The space race had begun in earnest, and the country suddenly had an urgent use for the very men it had quietly imported. The response came quickly. By the mid-1950s, von Braun's team worked at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville. When the earliest American satellite attempts stumbled, that team was ready. In January 1958, their rocket lifted a satellite called Explorer 1 into orbit. It was the first American satellite to reach space. The men from Peenemünde had helped put the United States into orbit. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was created, NASA, the civilian face of American spaceflight. Von Braun and his team were folded into it. He became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. The man whose name was on the V-2 now had a public, celebrated role. His team was not small, and its reach was wide. The engineers who came through the program worked across American rocketry for decades. They trained others. They built institutions. Their fingerprints are on missiles and on spacecraft alike. NASA's own histories record von Braun's central role in the effort to reach the moon. The contribution is not in doubt. Only its full context was slow to arrive. The crowning work is well known. Von Braun led the development of the Saturn V. It was the giant rocket that carried astronauts toward the moon. In July 1969, a Saturn V launched Apollo 11. Human beings walked on the lunar surface. It was one of the great achievements of the century. Consider what that rocket was. The Saturn V stood taller than a 30-story building. It remains one of the most powerful machines ever flown. It carried human beings 250,000 miles from home and brought them back. The line of engineering behind it did not begin in 1969. It reached back through Huntsville, through Fort Bliss, all the way to a coast on the Baltic Sea. And here is the uncomfortable symmetry. The same broad line of rocket engineering ran from Peenemünde to the moon, from a weapon built with slave labor to a spacecraft watched by the whole world. The record does not let us pretend those two things are unrelated. The people were, in many cases, the same people. The official narrative of the 1960s did not dwell on that. Von Braun became a public figure. He was an advocate for space and a familiar face. The wartime files stayed in the background. He appeared on television. In the 1950s, he worked with Walt Disney on films about space travel. He explained rockets to millions of American families. To the public, he was a friendly guide to the future. Few of those viewers knew the full contents of his file. The image pointed forward. The history stayed behind it. Von Braun died in 1977. By then, he was honored as a father of American spaceflight. The tributes praised the moon. The files that complicated the praise were still sealed. He did not live to see them opened. The triumph was loud. The provenance was quiet. That contrast is the heart of this episode. Now return to that word from the beginning, the word that changed. In the earlier security reviews, the harsh assessments existed. Then they were revised into something safer. The declassified record lets us see both versions. The official account said one thing to the public. The archive, opened decades later, showed the machinery behind it. Ask why it took so long. The men were celebrated in the 1960s. The full files were not opened until the late 1990s. For decades, the record and the reputation lived apart. It took an act of Congress to bring them together. That delay is part of the story too. A country can honor a result for years before it fully accounts for the origin. There is one more case worth naming because it shows the story did not simply end in glory. His name was Arthur Rudolph. He had been a manager at the Mittelwerk factory. He then came to the United States under the same program. And he had a real career at NASA. He was a project director on the Saturn V, on paper, an American success story. But the past did not stay buried. In the 1908, the 1980s, the United States Justice Department had an office that investigated wartime cases. It examined Rudolph's record at the underground factory. Facing that investigation, Arthur Rudolph left the country in 1984. He renounced his American citizenship. He had helped send Americans toward the moon. Then his record from before he arrived caught up with him. The office that pursued him had a name. It was the Office of Special Investigations inside the Justice Department. Its job was to find and act on hidden wartime pasts. Its very existence is telling. Decades after the program, the American government was still investigating people it had once recruited. The reckoning came late, but it did come. That is a documented outcome, not a rumor. A federal investigation, a departure, a citizenship surrendered. It tells you the tension in this story was never fully resolved, even by the government that created it. So what does the record finally establish, and what does it leave open? Let me separate the two clearly, because that separation is the whole point. The record establishes this. The United States ran a program to bring German specialists home after the war. That program was managed by an intelligence agency. Some of those specialists had Nazi affiliations. Some had records tied to a factory that used slave labor. Security files were, in documented cases, revised to ease their entry. Many of these men went on to build the rockets that reached space. All of that is on the record. What the record does not settle is the interior moral ledger of each individual. It does not tell us exactly what every man knew. It does not measure precisely how much choice each one had. The declassified files give us actions, ranks, memberships, and outcomes. They do not give us the private thoughts of the people involved. Where the archive is silent, an honest account stays silent too. This is why the story matters and why it is so easy to tell wrong. One temptation is to turn these men into pure monsters and erase what they built. Another temptation is to turn them into pure heroes and erase what they came from. Both versions lie. The documented truth is harder to hold. It is a country that wanted knowledge badly enough to look past how that knowledge was made. Sit with that sentence for a moment. It is not an accusation shouted from the outside. It is the conclusion the government's own files support. A democracy made a hard bargain in the shadows. It traded a measure of its stated principles for a measure of power, and it kept the terms of that trade quiet for 2 generations. That choice had consequences we still live with. The space program was real, the moon landing was real, and the origins were real too, including the ones written in the files that took 50 years to open. History asks us to carry both facts at once, admiration and unease, achievement and cost. It is tempting to drop one and keep the other. The archive does not allow it. It hands us the triumph and the factory in the same box. To be honest about one, you must be honest about the other. Now think back to that number. More than 1,600 specialists. And to that first file, the one where a man went from threat to asset in a few short months. The rocket did not change in that time. The engineer did not change. Only the paperwork changed. That was the machinery of Operation Paperclip. Not a single dramatic secret, but a slow, deliberate managing of the record. That was real. The fuller record is now public. It is held at the National Archives, open because a law demanded it. You can read the findings for yourself. The reports have titles and page numbers. The findings are footnoted. The uncertainty is stated plainly in the documents themselves. Historians will keep arguing about the men. That argument is healthy. It is what an open archive is for. That is the difference between history and myth. History leaves the hard questions on the table with the documents beside them. Next, the covert operation that reached inside another government and the files that took decades to surface. The surviving institutional record adds another useful layer. It also shows why careful limits matter. The central document point is simple. Post-war US. Programs recruited German specialists, including personnel who later worked in American aerospace programs. That sentence is a starting point, not a license to add details the evidence does not contain. The sources for this episode come from National Archives and Records Administration, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. They establish a record. They do not give us permission to invent private conversations, hidden motives, or cinematic certainty. Pause there. This was real, but historical confidence has boundaries. A responsible documentary makes those boundaries visible instead of hiding them behind dramatic music. The next documented limit matters just as much. The episode must distinguish documented personal histories from claims not established by the cited records. When viewers hear a secret program, a covert operation, or a Cold War crisis, they often expect a clean villain, a single decisive moment, and a complete answer. Institutional records rarely work that way. They preserve decisions, fragments, summaries, and later explanations. They can be powerful precisely because they are incomplete. So the question is not whether a dramatic version of the story would be more satisfying. The question is whether that version would still be true. In this episode, we stay with the documented record and name uncertainty where it remains. Evidence changes the way the story should be told. A document can establish that an institution acted, but it may not establish what every participant knew at every moment. A photograph can show an object or a place, but it may not explain the private calculation behind it. That distinction is the difference between history and performance. Subscribe for documented history, not myths. Tomorrow, the next number behind Operation Paperclip, the documents behind America's